Nick Barnes stopped the violence after a moment of truth. What he did next shocked everyone. The rise of a Harlem kingpin. The 1970s in Harlem were a crucible of ambition, desperation, and raw power. Amidst the crumbling tenements and the vibrant, yet struggling, cultural tapestry, one name rose to dominate the streets: Leroy Nicky Barnes. His journey from a petty thief to the undisputed Mr. Untouchable of the Harlem drug trade is a saga etched in the annals of true crime, a testament to a ruthless intellect and an unyielding will to conquer. Born in 1937, Barnes' early life was a stark reflection of the systemic disadvantages faced by many African Americans in post-war America. He grew up in a Harlem that offered few legitimate pathways to success, where the allure of the streets often overshadowed the promise of honest labor. His father was a laborer, his mother a homemaker, but the stability they offered was fragile. Young Leroy quickly learned that respect and power were not given, they were taken. His early forays into petty crime, shoplifting, numbers running, were less about malice and more about survival, a desperate scramble for a foothold in a world that seemed determined to keep him down. But Barnes was not content with mere survival. He possessed an innate charisma, a sharp mind, and an almost pathological drive that set him apart. He was handsome, articulate, and dressed impeccably, even in his early days. These qualities, combined with a burgeoning ruthlessness, made him a natural leader in the burgeoning criminal underworld. His early arrests and stints in prison, rather than deterring him, served as a brutal education. Behind bars, he honed his strategic thinking, forged alliances, and studied the intricacies of the drug trade, particularly heroin, which was rapidly becoming the currency of despair in Harlem. It was during one of his prison sentences, specifically at Green Haven Correctional Facility, that Barnes underwent a significant transformation. He immersed himself in books, devouring philosophy, law, and business texts. He learned to read and write proficiently, developing a sophisticated understanding of legal loopholes and organizational structures. More importantly, he connected with established Italian-American mobsters, learning the intricate workings of organized crime, the importance of discipline, hierarchy, and loyalty. He saw how the mafia operated with a cold, calculated efficiency that transcended mere street thuggery. He resolved to bring that same level of organization and ruthlessness to his own operations. Upon his release in the late 1960s, Barnes was a changed man. He was no longer just a street hustler. He was a visionary criminal, armed with a blueprint for an empire. He quickly began to consolidate power, leveraging his prison connections and his growing reputation for both intelligence and brutality. His initial strategy was simple: eliminate the competition. He didn't shy away from violence. In fact, he embraced it as a necessary tool for control. Rivals were either brought into his fold or brutally dispatched. His methods were swift and decisive, sending a clear message to anyone who dared to challenge his authority. Barnes' most significant innovation was the formation of the Council, a seven-man syndicate that controlled the heroin trade in Harlem with an iron fist. This wasn't just a loose collection of drug dealers. It was a highly structured organization modeled after the mafia families he had studied. Each member of the council had specific responsibilities, from sourcing the purest heroin from Southeast Asia, often through corrupt military contacts during the Vietnam War, to managing distribution networks, enforcing discipline, and laundering vast sums of money. Barnes was the undisputed chairman, the strategic mastermind who orchestrated every move. The council's operations were vast and sophisticated. They established a network of street dealers, known as crew chiefs, who managed their own territories. They employed enforcers to ensure loyalty and collect debts. They even had their own legal team, bribing corrupt police officers and judges to protect their interests. Barnes himself became a master of disguise, often appearing in public in elaborate costumes to evade detection, earning him the moniker Mr. Untouchable. The sheer scale of Barnes' empire was staggering. At its peak in the mid-1970s, the council was reportedly generating millions of dollars a month, controlling an estimated 70% of the heroin market in Harlem. Barnes lived a life of unimaginable luxury, owning multiple properties, a fleet of expensive cars, and a wardrobe that rivaled any fashionista. He was a celebrity in the underworld, a figure of both fear and grudging admiration. He was seen as a black man who had beaten the system, who had carved out his own kingdom in a society that had tried to deny him everything. Yet, this empire was built on a foundation of immense suffering. The heroin that flowed through Barnes' veins of distribution ravaged the Harlem community. Addiction rates soared, families were torn apart, and the streets became a battleground for turf wars. The violence that Barnes had used to build his empire continued to be its lifeblood, a constant threat hanging over everyone, from rival dealers to innocent bystanders. He was a king, but his kingdom was steeped in the misery of his own people. Despite the outward display of power and wealth, a deep sense of paranoia began to permeate Barnes' life. He trusted no one completely, constantly looking over his shoulder, knowing that every success bred new enemies. The very violence he wielded so effectively was a double-edged sword, creating a climate of fear that eventually began to consume him from within. The glamour of being Mr. Untouchable was slowly giving way to the crushing weight of constant vigilance and the moral decay of his actions. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about legendary figures and delve deeper into the lives of those who shaped history, for better or worse. The year was 1977. Nicky Barnes was at the zenith of his power. His face had graced the cover of the New York Times Magazine, emblazoned with the defiant title, Mr. Untouchable. He reveled in the notoriety, the public acknowledgement of his dominion. Yet, beneath the veneer of invincibility, cracks were beginning to form, not from external pressure, but from an insidious internal erosion. The constant vigilance, the endless cycle of violence, the gnawing awareness of the destruction he wrought, it was all taking its toll. The moment of truth for Nicky Barnes wasn't a single, dramatic epiphany under a street lamp, nor a sudden religious conversion. It was a slow, agonizing realization, catalyzed by a series of events that chipped away at his carefully constructed facade of invulnerability and moral indifference. One particular incident, however, served as the undeniable turning point, a stark mirror reflecting the true cost of his empire. It happened during a particularly brutal turf war with a rival crew. The conflict had escalated beyond mere drug disputes, spilling into the residential blocks of Harlem. One evening, a stray bullet, intended for a rival dealer, pierced the window of a ground-floor apartment. The bullet struck a 7-year-old girl, asleep in her bed, killing her instantly. Barnes received the news with his usual stoicism. He had ordered countless acts of violence, seen countless bodies. But this was different. This wasn't a rival, a snitch, or a competitor. This was an innocent child, a victim of the indiscriminate chaos he had unleashed. He sent money to the family, a customary gesture, but it felt hollow, insufficient. Later that week, he found himself driving through the very block where the tragedy occurred. He saw the makeshift memorial, a cluster of wilting flowers and flickering candles, a teddy bear propped against a lamppost. He saw the faces of the residents, not just fear, but a profound, weary despair. These were his people, the community he claimed to protect, the very people he had once believed he was empowering by providing an alternative path to wealth. But what wealth was this, if it came at the cost of their children? He stopped his car, an ostentatious Cadillac, a symbol of his success, and watched from a distance. He saw the girl's mother, a woman he vaguely recognized from the neighborhood, sitting on her stoop, her face etched with a grief so profound it seemed to drain the color from the world around her. She wasn't crying. She was beyond tears. She simply stared into the middle distance, a living monument to shattered hope. In that moment, something shifted within Barnes. It wasn't pity, not exactly. It was a cold, hard recognition of the futility of it all. He had built an empire, amassed a fortune, commanded respect through fear. But what was it all for? To see his community, his own people, reduced to this state of perpetual terror and sorrow. He had become the very oppressor he once railed against, albeit one who looked like them. The image of that mother, lifeless with grief, haunted him. He began to see the faces of the addicts, the broken families, the young men drawn into the cycle of violence, not as mere cogs in his machine, but as human beings, suffering. He saw the decay of Harlem, not just as a backdrop for his operations, but as a direct consequence of the poison he peddled. This internal reckoning was further exacerbated by the growing pressure from law enforcement. Despite his Mr. Untouchable moniker, the net was tightening. Federal agents, led by figures like Robert Morgenthau, were relentless. His associates were being picked off, one by one. The loyalty he demanded was beginning to fray under the weight of long prison sentences and the constant threat of betrayal. He realized that his empire, built on fear and illicit wealth, was inherently unstable, a house of cards perpetually on the verge of collapse. He also began to feel a profound sense of isolation. The lavish parties, the beautiful women, the sycophantic entourage, it all felt hollow. He couldn't truly trust anyone. Every smile was a potential deception, every handshake a possible prelude to betrayal. The very power he craved had imprisoned him in a gilded cage of paranoia. He was a king, but a lonely one, ruling over a kingdom of shadows and despair. The cover of the New York Times Magazine, once a source of immense pride, now felt like a target, a declaration of war against the entire federal government. He understood, with chilling clarity, that his public defiance had sealed his fate. He was too big to ignore, too visible to escape. The game was changing, and the rules he had mastered were no longer sufficient. The combination of the innocent child's death, the pervasive suffering in his community, the relentless pressure from law enforcement, and his own suffocating isolation coalesced into a profound moment of truth. He looked at his life, his empire, and saw not triumph, but a tragic, self-destructive cycle. The violence he had so readily employed had not only destroyed others, but was slowly, inexorably, destroying him. The realization was stark. He had to stop. The question was, how? And what would be left of him if he did? The decision to change, for a man like Nicky Barnes, was not a simple matter of moral awakening. It was an existential crisis. His entire identity, his power, his wealth, his very existence, was inextricably linked to the criminal empire he had meticulously built. To step away from it was to dismantle himself, to face an abyss of uncertainty and unimaginable danger. The internal struggle was immense. On one hand, the gnawing guilt, the weariness of constant paranoia, and the dawning realization of the human cost of his actions pulled him towards a different path. He saw the faces of the addicts, the broken families, the young men he had lured into a life of crime, and the image of the 7-year-old girl, a silent accusation. He was tired of the endless cycle of violence, the betrayals, the constant looking over his shoulder. He yearned for a peace that his opulent lifestyle could never provide. On the other hand, there was the immense pride, the fear of losing everything, and the ingrained code of the streets. He was Mr. Untouchable, a legend. To walk away would be seen as weakness, a betrayal of the very principles that had elevated him. His ego, meticulously cultivated over decades, resisted the notion of surrender. There was also the very real threat to his life. A man who knew as much as Nicky Barnes, a man who had orchestrated so much violence, could not simply retire. He knew too much, had too many enemies, and possessed too many secrets. His former associates, particularly those in the council, would view any attempt to withdraw as a profound threat, a potential weakness that could unravel their entire operation. The consequences of his decision were immediate and severe. As federal pressure mounted, Barnes found himself increasingly isolated. His lieutenants, once fiercely loyal, began to question his judgment, his leadership. The lavish lifestyle that had once been a symbol of his success now felt like a target. He was arrested in 1977 on federal drug charges, a direct result of the intensified efforts by the U.S. Attorney's Office. This arrest, however, was not the end. It was the catalyst for the most shocking decision of his life. While incarcerated, facing a potential life sentence without parole, Barnes had ample time for reflection. The walls of the prison cell, ironically, offered a kind of clarity that the chaotic freedom of the streets never could. He saw his former associates, the very men he had elevated to power, continuing their operations, seemingly unconcerned with his plight. He learned that some members of the council were even attempting to usurp his position, to take over his territories, effectively betraying the loyalty he had demanded and, in his mind, deserved. This betrayal was the final straw. It shattered any remaining illusions he had about the brotherhood of the criminal underworld. The very men he had trusted, The men he had made rich were now turning on him. The code of honor he had once believed in was a sham. He realized that his loyalty had been a one-way street, and that in the cutthroat world he inhabited, there was no true allegiance, only self-interest. The decision to cooperate with the authorities was not made lightly. It was a calculated move, born out of a desire for survival, a thirst for revenge against those who had betrayed him, and perhaps a desperate, nascent hope for a different future. He knew the risks were monumental. Becoming an informant was the ultimate transgression in the criminal world, punishable by death. He would be branded a rat, a pariah, forever. But the alternative, spending the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary, watching his empire crumble and his former associates flourish, was equally unpalatable. He initiated contact with federal prosecutors, offering to provide information that would dismantle the council and expose the vast network of corruption that had protected his operations. The prosecutors, initially skeptical, soon realized the immense value of Barnes' offer. He possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the Harlem drug trade, its players, its routes, its finances, and its connections to corrupt officials. He was the ultimate insider. The reaction from his organization, when news of his cooperation inevitably leaked, was one of shock, disbelief, and incandescent rage. The council, once a formidable force, was thrown into disarray. His former lieutenants felt betrayed, their lives and livelihoods suddenly jeopardized by the man who had once been their leader. Threats against Barnes and his family poured in, a testament to the depth of their fury. He had not only abandoned them, but had actively turned against them, violating the most sacred tenet of the criminal underworld. Barnes understood the gravity of his decision. He was burning every bridge, severing every tie to his past life. He was trading the precarious throne of a drug kingpin for the uncertain existence of a government witness. It was a terrifying leap into the unknown, a gamble with his life and legacy. But for the first time in a long time, amidst the fear and the danger, there was a flicker of something else, a strange, unsettling sense of liberation. He was no longer Mr. Untouchable, but he was also no longer a prisoner of his own making. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts about Nick Barnes' transformation. What do you think truly drove him to make such a drastic decision? The decision to cooperate with the federal government was the most audacious and dangerous move of Nicky Barnes' life, a complete repudiation of everything he had once stood for. What he did next shocked everyone, from his former associates to the hardened law enforcement officials who had spent years trying to bring him down. After his arrest and the realization of his betrayal by the council, Barnes began a meticulous and painstaking process of debriefing with federal prosecutors and agents. He spent countless hours, days, and weeks recounting the intricate details of his empire. He laid bare the structure of the council, identifying each member, detailing their roles, their financial dealings, and their criminal activities. He exposed the supply chains, from the poppy fields of Southeast Asia to the streets of Harlem. Crucially, he named names, not just of his criminal associates, but also of the corrupt police officers, lawyers, and even judges who had taken his bribes and protected his operations for years. His testimony was a goldmine for the authorities. Barnes possessed an unparalleled insider's view of the Harlem drug trade, a level of detail that no external investigation could ever hope to achieve. He provided evidence that led to the indictment of over 100 individuals, including all 6 of his former council members. His cooperation was so extensive and damaging that it effectively dismantled one of the most powerful drug syndicates in American history. The trials that followed were sensational. Barnes, once the epitome of defiance, now sat on the witness stand, a government informant, calmly and methodically testifying against the very men he had once called partners. His testimony was articulate, precise, and devastating. He recounted tales of drug deals, violence, money laundering, and corruption with an almost academic detachment, stripping away the mystique of the criminal underworld and exposing its brutal realities. The impact of his testimony was immediate and profound. His former associates, who had once mocked the idea of Mr. Untouchable ever cooperating, watched in disbelief as their empire crumbled around them. Many were convicted and sentenced to lengthy prison terms, their reigns of terror brought to an abrupt end by the man they had once revered and then betrayed. The The corrupt officials he exposed faced investigations, indictments, and the ruin of their careers. Barnes' actions were met with a mixture of outrage and grudging respect. In the criminal underworld, he was universally condemned as the ultimate rat, a pariah whose name would forever be synonymous with betrayal. Death threats against him were constant and credible, necessitating extreme measures for his protection. Yet, among law enforcement, there was an acknowledgement of his courage, albeit a cynical one. He had done what few others dared, turning against his entire past life to save himself and, in the process, delivering a crippling blow to organized crime. After his testimony concluded, Nicky Barnes entered the Federal Witness Protection Program. This was the ultimate severance from his old life. He was given a new identity, relocated to an undisclosed location, and forced to live under a veil of secrecy. The man who had once reveled in public notoriety, whose face had graced magazine covers, now had to live in anonymity, constantly guarding his true identity. His life in witness protection was a stark contrast to his former opulence. The flashy cars, the designer clothes, the endless stream of cash, all were gone. He lived a modest, quiet life, far removed from the glamour and danger of the streets. He worked legitimate jobs, paid taxes, and tried to blend into society. It was a profound adjustment for a man who had once commanded an army of drug dealers and lived by his own rules. This period of his life was marked by a quiet struggle for redemption. While his cooperation was primarily motivated by self-preservation and revenge, there was also a nascent desire to atone for the destruction he had caused. He reportedly expressed remorse for the lives he had ruined, the families he had torn apart. He became a cautionary tale, a living embodiment of the consequences of a life of crime. He even wrote a memoir, Mr. Untouchable, under his new identity, offering his perspective on his rise and fall and the ultimate futility of his criminal enterprise. His actions, particularly his willingness to expose the deep-seated corruption that had protected him, sent shockwaves through the criminal justice system. It highlighted the vulnerability of even the most powerful criminal organizations when an insider chose to break ranks. It also served as a stark reminder of the pervasive influence of drug money on legitimate institutions. Nicky Barnes, the man who had once been the embodiment of Harlem's criminal underworld, had done the unthinkable. He had not only stopped the violence, but had actively worked to dismantle the very system he had helped create. His transformation from ruthless kingpin to government informant was a shocking twist, a testament to the unpredictable nature of human choices and the complex motivations that drive them. Like this video to support more historical content and help us continue to explore these fascinating and often controversial figures. Nicky Barnes lived out the remainder of his life under a new identity, a ghost of his former self, far removed from the streets of Harlem he once dominated. He passed away in 2012 at the age of 78, his death largely unnoticed by the public, a stark contrast to the sensational headlines he once commanded. His ultimate fate, living in anonymity, was perhaps the most profound consequence of his moment of truth and the subsequent decision to cooperate. His impact on Harlem is a complex and often contradictory legacy. On one hand, he was a destructive force, a purveyor of addiction and violence that ravaged the community. The heroin he distributed tore apart families, fueled crime, and contributed to the decay of a once vibrant neighborhood. His reign, while bringing him immense personal wealth, left a trail of human suffering that lingered for decades. For many, he remains a symbol of the dark side of Harlem's history, a man who exploited his own people for profit. On the other hand, his story, particularly his later actions, offers a powerful, albeit controversial, lesson about redemption and change. His cooperation with the government, while born out of self-interest and revenge, undeniably led to the dismantling of a major drug syndicate and the exposure of widespread corruption. It demonstrated that even the most entrenched criminal empires could be brought down, and that the cycle of violence, however pervasive, was not unbreakable. Barnes' transformation, from ruthless kingpin to government informant, became a compelling, if unsettling, narrative. It challenged conventional notions of loyalty and honor within the criminal underworld. It forced a reevaluation of what truly constitutes power and success. Was it the fleeting glory of a drug empire, or the quiet courage to break free from its destructive grip, even at the cost of one's reputation and past identity? His story serves as a stark reminder of the corrosive nature of unchecked ambition and the seductive allure of illicit wealth. It highlights the systemic issues that push individuals into a life of crime, but also the personal choices that ultimately define their path. Barnes, in his early life, was a product of his environment, but his later decisions, however flawed their initial motivations, showed a capacity for radical change. The lessons learned from Nicky Barnes' life are multifaceted. For law enforcement, his cooperation underscored the critical importance of informants in dismantling complex criminal organizations. For communities struggling with drug epidemics, his story is a tragic illustration of the devastation wrought by such enterprises. And for individuals, it presents a challenging question. Can a person truly atone for a lifetime of wrongdoing? And what does that atonement look like? Barnes' life, particularly his later years, became a testament to the human capacity for transformation, even if that transformation was messy, complicated, and driven by a mix of motives. He was not a saint, nor did he ever fully escape the shadow of his past. But he was a man who, at a critical juncture, chose a path that defied expectations, a path that ultimately led him away from the violence he had once embraced. His legacy is not one of simple heroism or villainy, but of a complex individual caught in the brutal realities of his time. He was a product of Harlem, a kingpin who ruled with an iron fist, and then, surprisingly, a man who chose to dismantle his own kingdom. His moment of truth led him down an unexpected road, shocking everyone and leaving behind a story that continues to fascinate and provoke thought about crime, justice, and the enduring possibility of change. Subscribe to stay updated with inspiring stories of redemption and explore more narratives of individuals who navigated complex moral landscapes. Like and comment to help us reach more people interested in true crime history, and share your insights on Nicky Barnes' extraordinary journey.